Are we live now? We're good to go. Okay, welcome everyone. For those attending from all different parts of Australia and possibly internationally as well. Thanks for joining for what is the third webinar in the series on foot and mouth disease, but we also want to point out that we are covering lumpy skin disease as well. So there's a lot of work being done behind the scenes. The Industry Taskforce on LSD that started in April last year, as you may be aware, then morphed into covering foot and mouth disease a couple of months ago. And as part of that, Pork Australia became in under that task force with Margo, Andrae, and Wool Innovation Australia representing the wool industry. So it is truly a cross-sectorial task force, as it also includes dairy. So these webinars are predominantly focused on the red meat sector because we felt that there probably wasn't enough. We needed to tailor them to be specific to the red meat sector, but that doesn't mean that we don't cross-collaborate, and that's hence Margo is here for this one today. So we're very fortunate again to have the Minister to give us a rundown on what's been happening at his end. Fiona Simpson from the National Farmers Federation as well. Fiona will have to go reasonably early, so if you've got any questions for Fiona, you might just jump in quickly. Again, very fortunate to have Chris Parker from the National Animal Disease Preparedness Coordinator from the Department of Agriculture. And the first time we've seen Joe Buffone, who's the Director General of Emergency Management Australia. And as I said, Margo, Andrae talking about some of the experiences that the pork industry has had with Japanese encephalitis as well as African swine fever. And then at the end of it, we've got 40 minutes down for Q&A with Peter Dagg from Animals Health Australia. So without tying up any more time, I'm going to hand over to the Minister of Agriculture, Murray Watt.
Thanks very much, John. Good evening, everyone, and thanks again for the opportunity to join in the latest of these webinars. I think this is the second time I've participated in one of these webinars. I don't know if it was the first or the second that I was in previously, but thank you to everyone from industry who's been working so hard on these issues, and to all of the farmers and other members of the community who are watching in. Thank you for the work that each of you have done over the last couple of months in response to the increased threat of FMD and LSD. I know it's been a very stressful time for people. We've obviously tried to work as closely as we can with industry, and I think you've seen a pretty united front between the federal government and industry in how we've approached this. And hopefully that has given you both some clear direction on your farms, in your communities, about what we're doing and what we're planning to do. And hopefully it's given you some comfort that authorities, whether they be at government or industry level, are taking these issues really seriously and doing everything we can to ensure that Australia does remain free of these devastating diseases. You might remember when I probably last presented to you, the way I've sort of talked about our response as a government to the increased threat of these diseases, having got to Indonesia and then to Bali, is we're taking a three-pronged approach. And I just thought I might really quickly update you on what's happening at a government level in each of those three prongs. So the way I think about it, as I say, a three-pronged approach: increased action abroad, particularly in Indonesia. Secondly, increased action at home, at our borders and mail centres in particular. And thirdly, around preparedness, to make sure that we are ready as a country if the worst did happen and we did see an outbreak here. So just going into each of those three items in a little bit more detail. Obviously, assisting Indonesia in particular, but also other neighbouring or nearby countries to manage their existing outbreaks and prepare for potential future ones has been a really core part of our plan. You would have seen, I think I'd been to Indonesia when I last spoke to this group for meetings with the Indonesian government. And what that has led to is us being able to really open the door to providing more assistance to Indonesia to help them get on top of this outbreak. A few weeks ago, or a little while ago, our government had already delivered about 430,000 vaccines for lumpy skin disease into Indonesia, which are being used. But I'm very pleased to report that just in the last few days, the first batch of 1 million foot and mouth disease vaccines that Australia is providing to Indonesia have arrived in Indonesia, and they are now in the process of being distributed through Indonesia to get those jabs into livestock. As you may be aware, there's a worldwide shortage of vaccines for foot and mouth disease. So it has taken some effort on behalf of the department. And I thank Chris Parker and his team for the work that they've done in that regard and for everything else that they're doing on this front. But it's good news that those vaccines have arrived. It required certification and various things at the Indonesian government end as well. So that's now happened. And you may have noticed I gave a speech to the National Press Club a couple of weeks ago where I sort of talked about our plan for agriculture more generally. But as part of that speech, I announced that we were going to be providing an additional $10 million in support to Indonesia through our aid budget, using some of the aid money that was destined for Indonesia in this way. And that will provide several million more vaccines for Indonesia, along with additional technical expertise and other support as well. So hopefully, again, we've got the orders in to get these vaccines, we've got the processes underway, and we'll get them to Indonesia as soon as we can, recognising that there is that shortage. So there's quite a bit happening on that front. I'm going to be back in Indonesia myself, in Bali actually, for the meeting of the G20 agriculture ministers, so the biggest 20 economies in the world. All the agriculture ministers are meeting in Bali towards the end of September, and I'll be taking the opportunity while I'm there to have further meetings to ensure that any assistance that we can possibly provide to Indonesia is being delivered. So that's the first thing. The second prong is what we're doing at home. And since I last spoke to you, there's a range of extra measures that have now been implemented in Australia. We now, obviously, for some time have had sanitation foot mats installed in every international airport in Australia that is receiving direct flights from Indonesia. We have increased the number of biosecurity officers, increased the distribution of detector dogs. Some of you may have seen some of the publicity around some detections that those detector dogs picked up for us, most infamously the McDonald's products that someone, for some crazy reason, tried to bring back into the country. And that person is now probably paying off a $2,500 fine. So we've really ramped up efforts at the borders. We are inspecting every single mail item or mail package that comes in from Indonesia, because as probably most of you know, the biggest risk of this disease coming into Australia isn't so much a traveller from Bali, although that is a risk. The biggest risk is actually someone probably, unconscious or inadvertently, not maliciously, sending back beef jerky or some other mail product that might contain viral fragments. So that's why we're stepping up the efforts at mail centres as well. We've declared biosecurity response zones in all of our international airports to give our biosecurity officers greater powers. And a number of those things have never been done by any Australian government before. So we are breaking new ground, as well as adjusting things like the smart gate facilities that people put their passports through when they come back in the country, to ensure that we're picking up people who are returning from Indonesia, but via a separate country like Singapore, or if they're coming through Bangkok or something like that. So we've really widened the net as to the detections and the screening that's happening at airports. And then the third prong of our approach, which is relatively new. A couple of weeks ago, I announced that we were establishing a federal government preparedness task force to really make sure that we're ready as a country to cope with an outbreak of foot and mouth disease or lumpy skin disease if the worst were to happen. You're probably all aware that there are existing plans within governments. Most well known one is the AusVet plan, but there are other plans in place as well which set out what happens if there is an outbreak. And Chris and others can probably take you through in a bit more detail, and Joe will report on this as well about what would happen. But I suppose what I wanted to make sure of as the minister is not only to make sure that we are putting in place measures in Indonesia, measures at our borders and mail centres, but really making sure that we're totally ready as a federal government, as state and territory governments, and as industry to cope if there was an outbreak. And that ranges from everything from what we do on farms to what we do with supply chains and all the kind of spillover effects that an outbreak would have. That preparedness task force is now into week 3 of a 4-week project. They've been updating me every week with their work, and Joe Buffone, who's one of the co-leads of that task force, and ordinarily would be the Director General of the Federal Government's Emergency Management Team. He'll give you a bit of an address shortly about where we're up to with that Preparedness Task Force. But I mean, without giving all of Joe's secrets away, what he's been saying to me is that we can take comfort from the level of preparedness out there. The federal government, the state governments, industry are largely ready if there were to be an outbreak. But I think it's been a good thing to really get people working on this and talking to each other now, rather than reacting if something were to happen down the track. So they're the three main prongs that we're taking: the support overseas, more measures at home, particularly our borders and mail centres, and thirdly, preparedness. The only other couple of things that I thought I'd just really quickly mention, John, again, since I last spoke to this group and this audience, I had the pleasure of releasing Australia's first ever national biosecurity strategy. I probably, like a lot of people, was a bit surprised that we'd never had a national biosecurity strategy as a country, even though there had been a lot of good work happening. And really what the importance of that is that it means that the federal government and the state and territory governments, who obviously have a range of responsibilities with biosecurity, are for the first time really on the same page about what needs to be done with biosecurity. Now, the hard work now begins of implementing it and funding it and things like that. But at least we've actually signed everyone up to the same thing. And secondly, the other development probably since we last spoke is that at the first meeting that I convened as the new minister of all of the state and territory agriculture ministers with myself, we also reached agreement for the first time to roll out a proper national livestock traceability system. This is something that I know that industry has been wanting to see for a very long time, and farmers have been speaking to me about as well. And again, there's still a lot of work to do, you know, how we implement that, what it looks like, who pays for it, things like that. But it's a pretty significant development for Australia to have all of the ministers agree that this is necessary and that we need to get cracking on it. So that's basically the sort of package of things that we're doing. I can honestly tell you that this package represents the strongest ever response from any Australian government to a biosecurity threat that we've ever seen. As I say, there are things that our government's doing that no government has ever done. And some of these things are things that farmers and industry have been wanting to see happen for a very long time. That's not to say that that's the end of it, or that I think it's job done. We're still working on this day and night. And as more ideas and suggestions and new measures come to light, then we're happy to implement them as well. But can I close with just by saying again, thank you to the industry leaders who are participating tonight, and to everyone out to farmers, rural communities, for what we've all done collectively over the last couple of months. I absolutely recognise the stress that this episode has caused. Frankly, I think there are some people out there, both in politics and the media, who didn't play a constructive role and caused a lot of alarm that has been reported to me has already had impacts on our trade overseas, and that wasn't helpful. But I think that the people who you've got presenting to you tonight have had their eye on the main game, which is to keep the industry safe, keep our reputation internationally intact, and more than anything, to keep reminding people that we are free of foot and mouth disease and we are free of lumpy skin disease. And I can tell you that's the way I want to keep it.
Great. Thanks, Minister. A great update. Yeah, everyone appreciates the work that whilst the industry is doing a lot, the government is doing a phenomenal amount of work behind the scenes as well. So thank you for that. Just one question before you do go. Someone's just raised, you know, should we be considering raising the penalty from the $2,500 to something, you know, 10 times that? If you could just comment on that.
Yeah, that is something we are giving active consideration to, John. And I mean, I accept that $2,500 is not necessarily a massive penalty. Having said that, it's probably twice the airfare that this person paid to get to Bali, and it's probably 100 times more than the sausage and egg McMuffin that they paid for when they got on the plane. But as some of you would be aware, the former government did introduce some legislation, or was in the process of introducing legislation before the last election to, among other things, increase penalties. Unfortunately, for a range of reasons, that legislation wasn't passed before the election, but I've activated that again, working with the department, and we intend to be introducing some legislation that will deal with that as soon as we possibly can.
Great, thank you. And again, thanks for your time. It is interesting to see that the media hype has died down in relation to the hysteria, which is what we've always been saying. We need to be alert but not alarmed. Some numbers I saw the other day indicate that of all the incursions of FMD around the world, less than 10% are by human transmission. And of those, they were very close proximity, as in someone crossing a border, 5 miles away, or crossing a body of water to get to another, to get to their home base or their work. So I think we need to keep it in context that whilst we, as the Minister said, tourism, people travelling is a risk, by far the greatest risk and the greatest number of incursions of FMD around the world are caused by live animal trade, as we suspect was the case with goats going from Malaysia into Indonesia. Australia has almost zero risk of that happening. And the second greatest risk is by food transmission. And that can be someone carrying that hamburger back from Indonesia, but more likely it's going to be someone either sending a container of food that hasn't been properly prepared, or more likely when they're sending something through the post as well. So that's where the focus needs to be. That's when we're continuing to focus on it. And we're very pleased to hear that every parcel coming in from Indonesia is now subject to that inspection. So again, thank you. Okay, there has just been a question. Do we know about Airline Food? If anyone, you could just maybe comment on that as well.
Yeah, my understanding, John, is that all airline, the concern, as I understand it, is, potentially contaminated airline food coming back into Australia. And I have heard some suggestions that sort of thing has been responsible for outbreaks in other countries. I have asked about this, and my understanding is that all food on airlines is destroyed and disposed of on arrival into Australia, and doesn't sort of get into the food system, if you know what I mean. So it's dealt with by our biosecurity people at the border. So there's no way of that food entering the country. And that's not a new change. That's something that's been in place for some time, is my understanding.
Yeah, thank you. And Peter might add to that a bit later on as well when we get to the Q&A time. Again, thanks for your time. And
Pleasure.
I'll now go over to Fiona Simpson to talk about policy and advocacy updates from the NFF.
Thanks, John. I've got to head off, but thanks again for your time.
Thanks, Minister. Thank you.
Thanks, John. And look, thanks for everybody calling in tonight. And obviously still huge interest in the community, and industry still working hard on FMD and LSD. And might I say also varroamite is still a huge topic that we're involved in, particularly in New South Wales, and just making sure that we can understand that incursion and and we might have seen most of you will have seen that some of those borders have started to be relaxed a little bit now, as we've zeroed in on those red zones and those hot zones. So, but obviously something that particularly in New South Wales is still a huge interest for everybody. Look, it has been good to see the department and the minister, always on high alert, but really stepping up in the first few weeks, and some of the controls that the minister spoke about at the airport. Additional, whilst it might sound frivolous, sniffer dogs actually do pick up those food parcels in people's luggage that they might be just thinking that it's okay to bring into their family, or leftover items of food that they've had in some of those countries, and they're just too dangerous. So whilst the dogs sound frivolous, they actually do pick up those sorts of things, and 100% screening of parcels now coming in from Indonesia, and also added scrutiny on parcels from other hotspots, because we know that FMD is in, I think, 77% of the herd around the world, and a number of other of our neighbours, such as Vietnam, Malaysia, China, Brazil, all those different countries. So added scrutiny too on parcels from China and other destinations, because as has already been said, the likeliest way for FMD particularly to come in is through potentially the mail system, through food being sent and finding its way into our animal system, because not only has it got to be sent to Australia, it's then got to find its way into some sort of an animal supply chain, whether that be pigs. Margo's going to be talking a little bit more about pigs later on, or some other animals. So scrutiny picked up at the airport. There's an excellent video, John, we might ask Kirk or Charlie to see whether we can post the link to the video of some industry people going through the airport the other day, because I think people will be really interested to know that a lot of the things they don't see, so they might actually go through security and think, wow, we haven't been asked, nobody's been interested in us, we haven't been stopped, what's happening? And in actual fact, because a lot of the hidden controls are there, and those extra agents and those extra people that are observing people, that they're actually, you don't see them visibly all the time, then I don't think, it's quite a good thing that people are not feeling pressured or under too much scrutiny, but there is a lot of scrutiny at the airport that people are not aware of. So our position still is we want everybody screened and every parcel screened, and we want to make sure that we can keep stepping up. If there's things that we should be doing at our borders, let's keep doing them, whether they be at the airport borders or whether they be in other places where goods and parcels come in, whether they're making their way into our retail lines or our parcel systems or what it is. So very much engaged and involved with the departments, with the ministers at the state level and at the federal level, and making sure that we can understand some of the requirements around containment strategies. Of course, it's different. So FMD, we're hoping and we're sure that we'll be able to keep that out. LSD is completely different. And again, Margo is going to talk about encephalitis and things later on. But in actual fact, those are all vector-borne diseases. So it's very much a matter of, being very quick. If they do arrive on some sort of a monsoonal wind or with migratory species or insects, then we need to be able to really curtain those off. And I think you'll find later on the presentations from Joe and others really interesting in that space. So it's good to be able to hear about those tonight. We've been very engaged in, you would have been aware, there's a Senate committee that's been sitting called the Rural and Regional Affairs and Transport References Committee, which has held an inquiry just in last weeks into the adequacy of Australia's biosecurity measures and response preparedness. And we know that Australia has a world-class system, but we want to make sure that it stays that way. And successive reviews, and we've met again just this week with the new Inspector General of Biosecurity, successive reviews have found that we need to make sure that we act to make sure that it is fit for purpose, that it's fit to face this oncoming wave of threats and increasing threats from increased traveller passenger movement and increased parcel movement, increased freight movement that we have these days, and this increasing wave of threats that are getting ever closer to our shores. So engaging heavily with that committee, engaging in also the National Biosecurity Strategy. We were involved in its drafting in the previous government, and it's been really good to now see that strategy actually see the light of day, and it sets a framework. But it does still leave some big questions around what does the future funding look like? What does the future investment mean? What are some of the solutions for those? And it's been good to hear Minister Watt out in the news in the last couple of weeks talking about looking again at some of the levies that we have looked at before and that were recommended by some of these reviews. There was a previous Inspector General review. There was also a review called the Crake Review. They made a number of recommendations which so far have not been implemented in full, particularly in terms of cost recovery and user pays. So we stand ready and we will be engaging in all of those. We've absolutely welcomed the ministers and the government's additional $10 million to Indonesia, and we're really pleased that that's been delivered in a way where Indonesia have been able to take it and make the best use of it. And we've also been constantly talking to the Treasurer and to the Minister about should that need arise and should they see the need to put more support into countries like Indonesia, then industry would very much support that, because we know that strong biosecurity systems in our neighbouring countries mean strong biosecurity systems for us and keep those diseases just a little bit further away. So we're involved in that. And we, in some of the task forces that John's been talking about, that we've been looking at things like domestic containment strategy and also the development of the vaccine, which is still on the table. I won't talk about any of those things in full, but others can sort of talk about those if people have questions. Lastly, finalising the LSD National Action Plan. LSD, lumpy skin, just really a disease for bovines, so foot and mouth, of course, largely confined to those cloven-footed animals like the pigs, the deer, and we've been talking about, and Margo even might reflect a little bit on the feral pig plan as well, because we know that feral animals can be vectors just like domestic animals with FMD, but for lumpy skin it's just bovines, so buffaloes and cattle, and it's a vector-borne disease. So we're making sure we can focus on that as well. And the other thing that's happened is that the NFF committee made a recommendation that we change lumpy skin disease from a Category 3 disease to a Category 2 disease under the Advocacy Act, which means, has different implications for cost sharing. So we're actively looking at making sure that those acts that apply in these situations are very much up to date and fit for purpose for the diseases that we're now facing, and are able to respond in a really good way too, when we're talking about who pays, how it's paid, how is our response funded, and how can we keep improving our biosecurity system, which, as we know, is one of the strongest in the world. So, John, I might leave it there. Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for ringing in tonight. It's great to have you all on board.
Great, thanks Fiona for the update. And if anyone's got any questions specific to Fiona, you might want to get them in soon, because Fiona will have to disappear in 15 or 20 minutes. Thank you. So without any further ramble, I'll hand over to Dr. Chris Parker, who is the National Animal Disease Preparedness Coordinator and has been involved in the Lumpy Skin and Foot and Mouth Disease Task Force for several months, and has been we're very fortunate to have Chris in that role. I'll hand over to Chris.
Thanks very much, John, and great to be online again and virtually seeing faces again who I'm sure were in our last one, and it's great to participate. Look, the Minister's basically covered a range of the government action. So, John, I thought it might be useful as we put a little bit of colour and movement around some of those things that he talked about. And I think that if we focus on Indonesia to start with, obviously the recent arrival of 1 million doses of vaccine, and then the money from the government to give what's essentially going to be a third tranche of vaccine to Indonesia to be used, is all being done in consultation with the Indonesians and all coming at about the right time. If we think about the Indonesians who had purchased 3 million doses themselves, well, as of this week, they distributed 2.8 million doses of that, and then our million have arrived for a distribution. So the timing's important to ensure that we're meeting the logistics that they're able to manage, and I think that that's really important. Some facts and figures, if you like, is they've vaccinated over 1.6 million animals as of yesterday. They're seeing declining numbers of infection as far as that goes, from a peak in June. They're putting considerable effort into vaccination teams and ensuring that they're able to meet the needs of their producers. It is worth reflecting on Bali, and clearly Bali is of particular relevance to Australia, given the large number of travellers who go there. And I think that it's very clear to us that Indonesia is prioritising FMD control efforts in Bali. And that's probably for two reasons. And I suspect that the major reason is there's a whole series of G20 meetings. So not just the agriculture G20 meeting that's going to be there. There'll be a series of other meetings this year. Also, Bali has a history of being one of the first islands in the last eradication program to eradicate it. It's quite a controlled environment, and I think they see there are real opportunities to do that in that environment. We've been earlier this month sponsored some workshops with local Indonesian officials and Australian officials and others about what programs might look like and what their needs might be in regard to that. So I did just want to reassure folk that, this we see and are encouraging Indonesia to look at how they might manage this disease, and Bali seemed a good opportunity for a range of reasons to be able to put a little bit of extra effort in the initial stages. So in the sense that Bali and Indonesia are there, we're looking at, I thought I might also just go through some facts at the border. These are, interesting figures in the sense, but I think they give folk a sense of what's happening in that traveller pathway. We talk about pathways. And if you talk about travellers, we're talking about passengers coming in on aeroplanes. But I'll just read some figures here that during the week ending 21 August, there were 23,500 travellers arrived in Australia from Indonesia. Now, nearly 94% of those were coming from Bali. It's really interesting, but this is a really highly compliant pathway. And if we saw about 650 FMD risk items, which were seized, but 98% of those were declared. And so it's a highly compliant pathway. And so we were able to actually grab that and use the full strength of the system that's in there. Just remind people that, all travellers who are arriving in Australia from Indonesia, so all of them are risk profiled and they're subject to biosecurity assessment, and they're also subject to intervention where it's required. Now, some of that's quite sophisticated and some of it I probably won't talk about tonight, but it is a whole range of those things going on. If we then think about what's being seized, we've seized 14 kilograms of meat product from Indonesia coming in. Again, the vast majority declared, but also where it's not declared, we're using the full action of the law on that. And the Minister mentioned quite rightly the efforts that were put in place in regard to the fine issued to the individual who brought in biosecurity or FMD risk material. Worth just talking about waste, because I know the question was raised. The Minister, of course, was right, and he wasn't just right because he's the Minister. He was actually right in his facts. All food material that is on planes arriving from international destinations in Australia is treated as biosecurity waste. That is secured. It is disposed of by secure disposal methods, and that usually means either deep burial or incineration. And so that material, the Minister is quite right, actually never enters the country as such. It goes in a secure system that then goes off and is disposed of in a secure fashion that doesn't allow any chance of any pest or disease coming from that, including things like FMD and LSD. Finally, I just thought if we talk about the mail pathway, 100% of items, again, it's a really quite compliant pathway from Indonesia. There's about 8 items were seized out of a total of 2,500 mail articles. Mail can be a bit funny, as in, particularly with the way COVID's changed some of our trading patterns. We can have quite variable numbers of mail coming in, but certainly from both China and Indonesia, we're seeing 100% inspection of non-letter casts, so that's all the parcels and that sort of thing. And where non-compliant material is found, it is again destroyed and destroyed of in a particular manner, which ensures that it's no longer a biosecurity threat. The final thing I just want to talk about is something I talked about last time, is the assurance mechanisms that we've got in place around cargo. Clearly, cargo inspection occurs. There's a large number of containers into this country, but certainly any break bulk, which is open containers, and also things like machinery, all get 100% inspection from Indonesia. I think that those sorts of mechanisms are in place and have been in place for many, many years. And I'd remind people we've been dealing with the threat of FMD, of African swine fever, of a range of other exotic diseases for many years. And the system is well primed, and certainly the government investment that we've seen over the last a few months has further primed that system to ensure that we're doing the job of protecting the nation that we've been charged to do. And I think the work that we've been able to do, and Joe, obviously you'll be talking a little bit about this later as well, actually starting to link across the whole of government. And I've talked about this before in industry meetings where, I reckon, and I've been involved in agriculture for many, many years, I'm sure a number on the webinar will know, this response we do in a biosecure or a biological response has been pretty good for a period of time. And I think where we haven't been good is linking up with the rest of government. And I think it's a fantastic initiative to have the joint task force with Joe and Karen linking the two parts of government. And I won't steal any of your thunder, Joe, but it is one of the really positive things to come out of this disease detection of both lumpy skin and foot and mouth in Indonesia, is the way it's brought this response in a far more whole of government way, and a far more whole of industry and government way, and I think that's really encouraging. So, John, thank you. I know there'll be a number of questions, and I've probably forgotten to talk about a couple of things, but I'm sure they'll come up in questions. So, thanks again for the opportunity.
Great, thanks, Chris. And as Chris rightly points out, the number one priority is to keep FMD and LSD out of Australia. However, if it does get in, we will be very grateful to have someone like Joe Buffone at the helm to organise the response to it. So I'm going to hand over to Joe, who's Director General of the Emergency Management Australia. You're still muted, Joe. There you go. Joe, you're still on mute. Rhiannon, are you able to do that? Great, thank you. I think you're there now, Joe.
Okay, I've just comms checked. Can you hear me now?
Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, John, and thanks very much for the opportunity to speak to industry and the agriculture community. Look, the Minister and Chris have sort of touched on a couple of those points, as did Fiona. But I'll give you a bit of background to what's actually happened with the task force. But just reinforcing a couple of things. First of all, there is no FMD or LSD in Australia, so just echoing that point. The second is what we are doing is really about belts and braces. So it's making sure that we're looking at good risk management and good practice in preparedness. The third thing is, and just building on what Chris Locke said, that we are building on the existing very strong agriculture biosecurity system, and that we have comfort in that system. But what we are focusing on is the integration with the emergency management systems across the country and integrating it across governments. So that's federal government, state and territory government, local government, and industry. So that connection. And just as an example, I'm actually up in Darwin at the moment with I had a prior commitment on emergency management, but the NT Emergency Management Committee at the, with the police, emergency services, had FMD, LSD as a key agenda item and talking about how that was integrated. And I see that as a really positive step. And that wasn't staged, that was actually on the agenda as a result from some of the engagements and discussions. The other thing is that the Joint Interagency Emergency Animal Disease Preparedness Task Force was a very long name, of course. I mean, we are government, we wouldn't have a short, punchy name. We're looking at building on that strong biosecurity preparedness. So we are focused on foot and mouth and lumpy skin because they're the priorities at the moment. As you've heard, it is co-led by Karen Crossway. She's a First Assistant Secretary in the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry, and myself, and you've heard that I'm the Director General. It also brings together experts in biosecurity, animal health, logistics, crisis planning, national preparedness and response. So we've got Australian Defence Force, we've got Border Force, we have representatives from Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry, but they're specialists in that field. We've got specialist planners and a whole range of other players, and also Animal Health Australia that is directly connected into the task force. So we started on the 8th of August and we're commissioned for 4 weeks to develop and provide advice via a report to the Minister. And that's on the 5th of September, and we're also preparing a national action plan, which is really about identifying some of the themes that we need to reinforce. You've already heard around the risk for incursion, and Chris is the expert, so I'm not going to sort of touch on that. What we have done though, we've engaged in particular in the north with the Cattle Association, Buffalo Association and the Land Management Council, in particular focused on lumpy skin, so that we can, in particular understanding some of the challenges around, if there's an incursion in both the domesticated and some of the feral sort of animals there, and understanding what some of those cultural licenses might be in that environment as well. The other thing is we ran a scenario-based discussion for Northern Australia, so that was NT, WA and Queensland, stepping through the coordination architecture, so that's at every level: movement control, tracing and surveillance, vaccination, destruction, disposal and decontamination, We also then ran a similar scenario discussion based out of South Australia, but with South Australia, Victoria, Tasmania, and New South Wales. And we also have a stock standstill exercise planned for the 26th of this month, and all of that is informing, how we can build on and reinforce and integrate the ag biosecurity arrangements, and as Chris has said, and the Minister and Fiona, very, very strong, but with whole of government and the emergency management arrangements. The other thing is we're also, talking to states and territories to make sure that we understand where some of their vulnerabilities are, and we're looking at, we've developed sort of like a scenario which is most likely and what is most dangerous scenario. So the sort of two extremes of the event. And also we're looking at what are some of the second and third tier consequences. So we know that if there is an incursion, and there's already work being done, but what does that mean around trade? What does that mean around the economy? What does that mean around impacts on communities? What does that mean to livelihoods, across the livestock sector? What does that mean in terms of mental health impacts? Because we know that there is, significant pressure. We're also looking at the learnings from COVID as well, because there are some similarities to, COVID and an FMD incursion. So we're going, really pretty much full bore. We're very, very closely connected with Chris Parker's work, and I want to acknowledge the work that Chris, continues to do with, his colleagues. Also, Animal Health Australia. That's a critical factor. But importantly, being connected with the industry at every level. If there's one thing that I can talk about, it's actually about how we go from zero to a suspected or actual incursion. And I talk about it as speed to action and speed to decisions. So, it's really about how we ramp up very, very quickly and be able to respond very, very quickly to operationalise all the plans that are in place. And for us, that's quite a focus. Nobody's in all the engagements that we've had and all the discussions, nobody's turned around and disagreed with that as a principle, that we have to act very, very fast and ramp up and surge very, very fast. So, John, I'll stop there and I'm happy to take any questions.
Great, thanks, Joe. So we'll, Joe, you're able to stay on till the end of it, hopefully.
Yeah, I can.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, I can stay on, John.
So we'll put all those questions towards the end after we hear from Margo. As I said, Margo heads up Australian Pork Limited, but would be well known to many people in this audience from previous roles. So Margo, over to you to talk about the pork industry's experience.
Excellent. Thank you, John, and good evening, everyone. It's really interesting to reflect. It's 3.5 years ago that I was actually with the beef industry and sitting at the International Beef Alliance over in Brazil, and we'd been actually touring farms over there who were trying to become free of FMD through ceasing their vaccine programs, because many of you would know that if you're still vaccinated, that doesn't mean you're free. It's a different structure and a different classification. And it was around that time that we actually saw African swine fever start to hit the globe. And to be honest, it was devastating. Like the footage that was coming out and watching it. And just to give you a bit of context is that 30% of the global pork production has been wiped out through African swine fever. And very similar to FMD, it is spread through products, it's spread through touch. It is a disease that knows no bounds, no borders, as we've learnt. So I guess for us, if people actually ask me now, why do we seem a bit calm? It's because ASF, foot and mouth disease, we've been living and breathing it for the last 3 years. So I thought I might, I won't take too long, but I thought I might just give you a quick snapshot, given that we've also this year faced Japanese encephalitis virus. So I'm very pleased to sit here 3.5 years later, post that visit, to actually say Australia is African swine fever free. And that is in both our feral herd and our domestic herd. And I don't say that lightly. because it has been a very tough few years for industry, but it is a really unique opportunity to prepare for an outbreak as opposed to respond to an outbreak. And that is just something that I think all of us here on these calls should be very grateful for. So if I think back to 2019, really the first and foremost was that collaboration, those discussions. So we started those discussions from a government perspective. It was really working with the government around the preventions that we needed. But as an industry, we worked on actually what the data was telling us. And I can't say that loudly enough of what is the data telling us? How can we beat an incursion? How farms are prepared and how we prepared as individuals and also how we prepared as an industry. So if I think back since 2019, the pork industry has really focused on emergency animal disease preparedness, and most importantly for us, African swine fever, but foot and mouth disease was actually front of mind as well. And we knew we needed to do more to not only protect our pigs, but we had to protect our people and our supply chain whilst this horrible virus ran rampant across the country. We've never seen biosecurity threats move at the speed that they're moving now, but we have people going in all directions. We have cargo, we have packages. It's a whole new world. So if I reflect our approach, it was really about how could we beat an incursion? How could we keep our farms safe? And how could we better prepare our people and our industry? So just to run through, we work directly with the industry around what ASF would look like on our properties and across the supply chain and what the industry needs to be doing, such as what does a permitting system look like? We ran exercises with state and federal governments and shout out to everyone who was involved in that. We wanted to see what a response looked like. We wanted to understand what destruction, disposal and decontamination looks like. It is a devastating disease that the animals would need to be euthanized. We didn't even have the capacity to do that, let alone the mental health and wellbeing toll on our people. So we had to look at alternatives. We had to look at even truck washes. How do we make sure that if it did get to one farm, how do you stop it going to the others? Engagement in the global work on the vaccines. So globally, there's an awful lot of work happening on vaccines. So Australia needed to be involved, needed to be aware. What does that look like? And what involvement can we actually have? We were looking at the modelling of what an outbreak would look like, and that even flowed through to the economic cost. So we know that an outbreak of African swine fever is about a $2 billion impact. But if I relate that to FMD, we know that's about a $50 billion impact. So where not only does it disrupt food supply, food security, the economic ramifications of that are also huge for everybody involved. We did revisit our compensation and valuation work to make sure that if there was an outbreak under the cost sharing arrangements of the emergency animal disease deeds, that were fair prices for our producers that would actually mean that if when we got through an outbreak, we could actually work with our producers to rebuild. There's no use having an outbreak and having nothing in place to help producers rebuild. And it just takes away Australia's ability to be a reliable source of protein. We wanted to have those clear links between the federal, state and local governments and into our industry. So that's really important, ensuring that our industry had liaison officers that were ready to step in and support the government response if a disease broke here. And I don't say that lightly. We need to make sure as industries we have people at the table who, dare my favourite line, skin in the game. They have to understand what those decisions, we cannot sit in offices and make decisions on behalf of people and on behalf of farmers that don't really understand the consequence of those decisions, or dare I say it, don't have accountability. So having industry people trained as a liaison officers, and I think we've got over 50 now, is just really important. We really wanted to understand our own industry inside and out and identify those gaps. And that's where we started to really look at what data. I often talk about as a data highway that runs across our heads. How do we actually bring that down? And so over the last couple of years, we've worked, we now have a visitor app that takes 20 seconds to alert the producer to let them know that the person about to walk on their farm is a threat, and they can actually stop that person coming on. We're now working with the transport companies to really understand the movements of the trucks once the pigs are on the truck, but even more when they're not on the truck. Where they've been, have they gone through a truck wash? What are the risks to those farms of those things outside your farm? So you've got to think outside your farm in terms of how do we do that, and as an industry, we can be doing that on behalf of our members. And so there's so much opportunity around the data that we've been exploring. But most importantly, our next step is, if we've got all this data, how do we actually give that back to the producers? If there is an incursion, the producer has the data in one spot. It's a click of a button to get the data to the people who need that information to get those permits moving, to get the food moving. We don't have the luxury in the pork industry of being able to keep pigs on farm. It's a 9-10 months cycle that you just can't turn off. And so we need to actually keep that supply chain. And most importantly, we have a role in providing that food to consumers to make sure that we can keep that. So if we take it to the bigger picture of not just pork, we're looking at beef and lamb and everything else. You know, you need to be avoiding that panic. So we need to be able to get those supply chains moving. We need to get those permitting systems, and data is really crucial to that. As Fiona said before, we took on the feral pig coordinator roles here. Whilst we are domestic pigs, we recognise that there is a huge issue for ASF, but also for FMD around the feral pigs. So we started looking at the geographical spread, the risk to the production areas. We're working with government to secure funding on what that looks like. And now we've actually established, with consultation with hundreds of producers, so thank you to everyone who's been involved in that, on actually setting up demonstration sites to manage those best practices approach to targeting feral pigs. We know we need to suppress 70% of the herd in the feral pigs to really have an impact. And so we've gone multi-pronged with those responses, and it's very much what the baiting programs look like, what the culling programs look like, what are those plans that producers need to have on their farm. But really importantly, it's about landholders working together. There's no use one landholder doing something amazing on their farm and the next door neighbour not doing something. So it's about how do we bring that all together, and most importantly, how do we work to protect those barriers, and looking at the Indigenous Rangers program, for example. How do we make sure they've got the resources to really be on the front foot and protect our country for things that are coming through as a threat? So there's lots of concentrated efforts going on there, and there has been a lot of reduction in the numbers, but I can tell you there is a lot of feral pigs in this country, so a lot more work, and we just need to be working together. Look, in flowing through, I guess, very conscious of time, but I just wanted to really, I guess, summarise some key messages that we chose not to give in and say when ASF arrives. We did everything we could to keep it out. We worked with government. We made sure we had those connections, and made sure as an industry we were doing everything we could to utilise our own resources. So not always about everyone else. We wanted to make sure as an industry we're protecting. We developed our own people. We put plans in place. And dare I say it, on the 25th of February this year, when I got a phone call late at night from Animal Health Australia saying there is a virus, we don't know what it is, it's suspect, but it's not looking good. Over the next 12 hours, all of that testing came up that it was Japanese encephalitis virus, which was not an exotic disease, it was zoonotic. So not only did it not affect our pigs, it impacted humans. So what we realised over those few days was a very scary state of play, that mosquitoes had brought in Japanese encephalitis virus into the country. How? We don't know. We believe it could be on a cyclone, it could be on anything, but we just suddenly, over a very short time frame, we went from one suspect case to being impacted 4 states, 79 products, and at a 79 properties at a speed we've never seen before. So that first 15 days really relied on the fact of following the process, and most importantly, working together with industry and government. And even with the government, we had to work with Health and Ag. We were working with government on opportunities around what we do, how do we respond. The chief veterinary officers were working night and day. Our industry liaison officers were working night and day in those first few days. But most importantly, they knew who to pick the phone up to. So they knew who to talk to. They knew why the chief veterinary officer needed that information. And that is just very important, to have those right people around the table in that. And I do come back to Japanese encephalitis virus was impacting humans, and I'm very devastated to say people lost their lives. But until our pigs actually came back with that testing, the health departments didn't know they were testing for Japanese encephalitis virus. So that connection between people and animals is just so important. So it was good to see that the testing happened very quickly, that the government labs responded very quickly, that our vets worked together, that it was just a fantastic response. And I do have to give a shout out to everybody who was involved, because when you get those first phone calls late on a Friday night at 9:30 at night of there's an issue, and you don't know what it is a very scary place to be. And then to see the industry and government work so closely together, I can confirm it does work. It doesn't work perfectly, there's still gaps, but it was a great test. So Japanese encephalitis will start again in September when the mosquitoes start to come back up, and now our producers are on high alert for those mosquitoes, and we'll be working again for government to be taking impacts on mosquitoes on those waterways, which are just really important. So I guess my really key takeaways for today, I was trying to make some good takeaways. If you are a farmer, please make sure you're doing everything you can on your farm. Have your biosecurity, on-farm biosecurity plan in place. Have your contingency understood by everybody on the farm. Make sure you're reviewing these plans. Analyse the gaps within your business so that you understand your risks and you know what is coming, what you need to be doing. Don't just tick a box and flick it. Do your biosecurity plan. But for industry reps on the webinar, when you're making sure you're connecting with your state-based regulators and have people trained and in place ready to play those roles as those industry liaison officers, and that you have your systems in place. As a country, really, and I say this quite openly, we need to make sure we're pushing back those borders as much as we can to really keep these emergency animal diseases out. We have to make sure that products aren't coming into the country, what we can be doing to keep them out. And I know the government is very keen to look at those options, but they are our line of defence of keeping it. And lastly, it's about bringing all of Australians along. It's not us bringing a package in the mail. It's not us bringing McDonald's back on planes. It's average Australians who don't have that connection from food security back to our farms. So we need to be doing more to convince the average person on the street that we have the most amazing food products here. They are made with quality Australian ingredients, and you don't need to have products sent in the mail. For 42 tonnes of pork products to be confiscated over a 6-month period, with 50% testing positive for African swine fever and 2% for FMD, these products are continuing to come in. So we have to get that message out. So I'm really hoping that's helpful. We didn't give up, and I think everyone on here, let's do everything we can to keep these diseases out, because it might be FMD today, but it could be anything tomorrow. So thanks for having me, and I hope that was helpful.
Thanks, Margo. That was some very good lessons there from the pork industry that no doubt the rest of us can take home and learn from. So I think it is important that people look at those liaison officer roles. I know in our own business we had someone went through that course today, came back saying we really need to get more liaison officers out there, because those roles are the keys between what happens on farm and what happens between the government. So I'd encourage anyone to either do it themselves, line up for those courses, or to consider putting people through it, because we just can't have too many people in that role. Thank you. So I'm going to open up for questions now. We're sort of limited it down. We've only got 15 minutes. I think we might have addressed this one last time, but because not everyone was on that call the last time, but and I don't know whether it's Peter or probably Chris can answer about why we're not going with a preemptive vaccination program. Chris, are you right with that one?
Yeah, look, John, I think probably there's a little list in our chat here, which is, I think, being curated. So I'll answer the first two, right? The first is in regard to a preemptive vaccination strategy, right? We are not considering a preemptive vaccination strategy. And the reason we aren't doing that is it fundamentally changes our trading status and will lock us out of markets we currently have access to. So that is the answer to that question. I know that's a bit blunt, and I apologise to the person who asked the question, but that's the fundamentals of what we're dealing with. There's a second question there, which is talking about the forecast of risk, and where we talked about last time, I think it was 11.6%, and it says, has this risk increased? the simple answer is that we are in the process now of just doing another one of these structured judgments, these structured expert judgments, which is what we use to actually find that. I think intuitively with the increasing control measures that are in place by Indonesian authorities supported by Australia and the increased border measures, I think the risk is likely to have decreased. To what level and exactly what that looks like, I'll leave that to that structured expert judgment, but we'd be looking at doing that the next little while. So that's sort of the first couple, John. Sorry to grab another one at the same time.
No, that's great, Chris, thank you. And I'm not sure who would, whether it's going to be Peter, or Joe or Chris to answer the next one, which relates to the amount of equipment we have and the human resources to respond, such as, you know, captive bolt for destruction of animals, mobile yards, vaccination, guns, PPE equipment, etc.
I'm happy to start off, John, if that's okay. And
thanks, Peter. Yep.
Hand over to Joe from there. But basically, I would gather that from the work that Joe's doing, that some information will come out of that will feed into this and provide advice on this question. But I can definitely say that every state and territory is absolutely doing a lot of work in this space and have been doing a lot of work in this space for many, many years to make sure that they do, you know, consider that make sure they've got enough resources, both people-wise, but also in terms of equipment as well. So I know that there's a lot of work going on there, and as I said, Joe's work will probably reveal more information on that. Just on the vaccination guns, etc. So in terms of the vaccine bank that we talk about, we also have vaccine guns and, you know, vaccine equipment available to be able to vaccinate the animals if we need the vaccine. So we've definitely got that under control, that one.
Right, Joe.
See if I can unmute John.
Yeah, I can hear you. You're right.
Oh, great. You can hear me?
Yes, far away.
Yeah, thank you. So we haven't quite finalised the position on workforce and that capability, but it's definitely identified as something that we have to look at and plan for. But the fact that we're looking at how we work with emergency management agencies, how we work with whole of government, how we work with industry is, you know, a way of building that surge capability, and also looking at where are some of the gaps are in terms of specialists such as vets, epidemiologists, and there's also some work that has previously been done on getting international specialists in, such as vets and epidemiologists, etc. And we're just making sure that that is aligned and, you know, contemporary for today's needs. So a little bit of work that will need to go on that, but it's definitely part of our focus. The thing around, we're describing them as mission critical supplies. That's come up in some of our work as well. And so we are looking at doing some further work on making sure that there is enough supplies either coming into the country or in the country to deal with that surge requirement. So thanks, John.
Thanks, Joe. And I suppose we also need to be conscious that there's a large degree of responsibility back on individuals as well, not just relying on the government. So I know within our own business, we have ordered supplies of PPE. We have ordered supplies of truck washdowns, and we've ordered one for every station. So we're certainly ourselves within our own business taking that responsibility on, not just relying on the government to put everything in place for us. So thank you. The other questions come up again, and I think it might have come up previous as well, but is the methodology for valuing of livestock, which is outlined within the plan. Chris or Peter, are you closest to answering that one?
Off you go, Pete.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I'm happy to answer that one. So just be very clear that the valuation process for livestock is a state and territory jurisdiction responsibility, and it falls within their legislation as to what stock will be what animals will actually be compensated for if there is an outbreak of an emergency animal disease, under what circumstances, and then the actual valuation is an agreement that will need to be made between the farmer at the time and the state, at the responsible state. So it's, while AusVet Plan and the ADRA has some guidance on how that might occur, the actual operational side of that will stay with the state or territory government.
Thank you. Okay, a question for Margo. There's a lot of pork imported. Is there a way that we can address that and promote the Australian pork industry as being the clean alternative? And I suppose the question leading from that, is there a risk around the importation of pork product from overseas countries?
Yeah, okay, so I will take a plug there. So many people would not know that 70% of the ham and bacon on your shelves is imported. So if you can, when you go to buy ham and bacon, turn the product over and check the country of origin labelling and make sure it's above about 60-70%, and you can be sure you're supporting Aussie pig farmers. But to answer the question, John, Australia does not allow the importation of fresh pork. We only allow the importation of cooked pork. So people can be sure that products coming in through imported, despite regular assessments of them, they do have to be cooked to temperatures that would kill any of these diseases. So whilst we would prefer everyone to buy Australian, the risk there is not a risk there. So, but we constantly review that to make sure that we are protected.
Great, thank you. Next question is, will there be consideration given to enforcing pig control over all lands? I'm not sure, again, if that's probably going to be a Peter or maybe a Chris question.
Look, John, I'll kick off if you like, and I think that the issue of feral animals is a bit of a vexed one, in the sense of it depends a little bit on which exotic disease there is. I think it's important to recognise the experience overseas, where feral animals have not played a significant role in the epidemiological spread of the disease in that sense. Some modelling that's certainly been done in Australia talks about and articulates around that feral pigs may not be as significant as what we might think they might be. And I think that that's important to recognise. Feral pigs do have quite a limited spread, and certainly where you have control measures in place in what I'll call the domestic herd, so the owned herd, if you like, the role of feral animals may not be as great as what people think. However, we don't know that for sure. We also know that if we are to get an exotic disease and it gets into a feral population, I think one of our challenges will be in a trade sense about how then do we say the nation is completely free, and there'll be a whole lot of testing required of feral animals. So I think they complicate any issue. How significant a role they play, it's not as great as what people think. Let's not forget these are diseases that animals get and either die or get better, and if they get better, they're immune. And so I think we need to just keep that in mind, and particularly feral pigs, there is no carrier state for FMD. They get it and get well or die, and that's it. So, you know, again, it depends on the disease, depends on the animal, but that's not to downplay the role of ferals. But I don't think they're as a significant thing as what some people out may have articulated.
Thanks, Chris. And again, I suppose I make the point that personal responsibility needs to come in this as well. And, you know, if you have feral pigs, would encourage everyone to do shoots and get those under control as quickly as you can, either shooting or poisoning. Okay, so the question came up about the length of time it took to get vaccines into Indonesia. You know, the million that have gone in there now and the millions before that. How confident are we that the 7-day target from the FMD bank in the UK will be met?
So just to start, significant vaccine went in that the Indonesians bought reasonably early, and that was 3 million doses. The challenges for them was actually distribution of that. So let's not confuse the two things. There is certainly a shortage of FMD vaccine on the world market. And Peter, I'll let you finalise the answer, but we've got contractual arrangements. It's held as an antigen. It gets made up by BI, and we will have it in the 7 days. I don't think there's too much doubt about that, and it's 1 million doses. But Peter, you might be able to add a little bit more to that one.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Yeah, that's correct. And I guess the distinction to make here is that we actually have this vaccine in the antigen form, held securely in the UK. So it is there now, and it will be available, you know, in the event of an outbreak. So it is totally separate to that shortage of vaccine worldwide, where we actually have this available, and it will. And as Chris said, there are contractual arrangements in place with the manufacturer, and we are in active discussions with the manufacturer now to make sure that everything is in place and that we'll get that vaccine into Australia within those 7 business days.
Great, thank you. Okay, a question for Joe. Will there be a public report published from the task force on the scenario modelling and the impact modelling? Oh, I think Joe might have frozen on us and dropped out, so I'll come back to Joe on that one. Oh, you there? Go back again. Great, thank you.
Okay, thank you. So, John, the Minister has commissioned the report, so we will provide him with the report. It will be up to him around whether he releases it. So I can't speak on his behalf, but he will own the report.
Great, thank you. So, yeah, probably a question next time for the Minister. Thank you. Another question on the government following through on the establishment of a national livestock gene bank to help protect our livestock genetic diversity. Again, probably, is that a Chris question or animal health? Get a Chris, you're getting a lot of them tonight, Chris.
Thank you, John. Always the easy ones too, hey? Look, government commitments is part of the budget, and I'm going to be a little bureaucratic here. I do apologise to colleagues, but also to those on the web. Look, they are matters for government. We have a range of policy initiatives that we are advising government on at the moment, as far as what may or may not be funded in the budget, but they really are matters for the government. I'm aware of a number of friends of mine, and also a number of people who own, stud stock and particularly seed stock and those sorts of things, who are making these sorts of arrangements commercially as well. And I think that for those who have particularly special genetics, I think that this is part of a normal risk management approach. I mean, whether it be fire or flood or an exotic disease coming through and knocking out those animals, I think that there would be those mechanisms and are those mechanisms in place. And I'm certainly aware of friends and seed stock owners who are making themselves availing themselves of those particular services. So I'm sorry that's not a great answer, and I do apologise for that. But it's not really a matter for me to be saying yes, the government will be re-establishing or establishing a national livestock gene bank. But I think that all these things are in the mix as far as being able to have discussions with government about what may or may not be in budgets.
Yeah, Peter, do you want to add to that?
No, look, I don't think I've got anything else to add to that. That's all good, thanks.
Yeah, I think we need to keep that one in context too. This is not going to be a disease that wipes out the whole beef industry or sheep industry or pork industry. If it comes in, it will be in spots, and yep, certainly there's within that hotspot there's elimination within that zone. But this is not a disease that suddenly every animal in Australia is going to be wiped out. It's just not the way the disease spreads or works. So, and again, I go back and say that the personal responsibility, again, within our own business, we're putting down 1,000 embryos, to as that part of that bank. It's just a risk protection. So I think everyone needs to probably take that on board themselves if they think they've got genetics that can't be easily replaced. So, okay, another question is, what's the estimated stock numbers in cattle, pigs, etc. in Bali, and do we have enough? Will the Indonesians have enough, both with their own stores and our stores, that we've provided to vaccinate every animal?
John, you beat me, and the questioner has beaten me, because I don't think I could tell you the exact number of stock that cloven hooked or susceptible animals are in there. There is about 60 million in Indonesia as a whole, and I'm very happy to provide that number and have it put through the processes so we can get that question answered. If you give me a minute, I can probably even try and look it up. So maybe go to some other ones quickly.
Okay, thank you. Okay, another one. I'll just go back. Is it possible to arrange a webinar for the horse industry who will be collateral damage on FMD due to the standstills? Is there any, Peter, you cover the all horses, all species, so is there a response to that one?
Yeah, thanks, John. Yeah, so it's a good question actually. So both horses and also poultry, you know, they're also possibly impacted as well. So good question. I'll take it back and see if we can organise something from an AHA's perspective. Definitely.
Right. Thank you. Sale yards. Sale yards have come up before as a potential hotspot because the commingling of stock from all over the place. It's the it's the preschool of the livestock sector. What plans are in place to increase biosecurity measures for those ones?
So, John, I might take that one if that's okay. Yeah, so AHA is in active discussion with sale yards to improve their biosecurity practices, etc. And we've been doing that for a number of years, so not just in this current situation. There's a couple of things going on there. One is in terms of biosecurity. The other one is in terms of their role in an actual outbreak situation. So we have what we call an enterprise manual for the sale yards and also transporters as well.
I'm just frozen there, I think, Chris. Peter, sorry. I might come back to that one. Peter seems to have a slow connection there. Okay. There's the issue around compensation for live animals, for animals that are destroyed. Are there any plans afoot for compensation for the rebuilding as part of the herd? And again, it's probably more a political question that probably no one on this call is probably going to be able to answer unless anyone wants to have a crack at it.
John, what I can say, okay, and it's not even overly political. I think part of an adjunct to Joe's task force is that the department is, as in Department of Agriculture, is working through a whole range of policy options at the moment in regard to what levels of support will be required by communities and individuals if we were to get this sort of disease. Now, we are all familiar with some of the policy and support mechanisms around drought. Now, some of those may be relevant, some of them will not be relevant. And there will be other policy responses that will be required. So it is certainly in the planning, and that sort of work is going on as we speak. And so, again, those sorts of options will be provided to government, obviously not for immediate funding because we don't have these jolly diseases, but certainly that thinking is going on. So if something terrible was to happen, we would be in a better position to push the button on some of that. And I know Joe's task force is also turning its mind a little bit to some of that stuff as well.
Thank you. Joe, did you want to comment? Joe's on mute, I think. Oh, back. Back again, Joe? No, still on mute. Seem to be having some connection issues there. Look, I am conscious of time. We've gone 6 minutes over, and I realise everyone's got other commitments and things to go to. And we haven't quite answered all the questions, but I think we've sort of got to the hub of them. So we will have another seminar within the next 2 or 3 weeks on a topic yet to be determined. Look, Kirk's already freezing up at that thought that he's got to organise another one. So look, thanks everyone for your time. And for all those speakers, I really appreciate the fact that this is all after hours and really appreciate your time. Appreciate the fact that so many people have dialed in from around Australia. So it's really encouraging that everyone's taking this very seriously. So thanks everyone for your time, for your input and your interest in this important topic. Till next time. Thank you.